The torch of prophecy illuminates the centuries. The profound influence of the Bible prophecies on the vital concepts of mankind, and hence on the welfare of the church in the course of empire, stretches across the centuries. The testimony of an unending procession of competent expositors of prophecy and its fulfillment is found in every major epoch and appears at every important turning point of history. Bible prophecy may aptly be likened to a flaming torch, lighting up the darksome highway in the passage of the centuries, illuminating the unfamiliar surrounding scenes, and identifying the advancing time and place of mankind in its march across the pages of history, ever onward toward the goal of ages. From generation to generation, the lighted torch of prophecy has been passed on from one hand to another, and from one group to the next, sometimes flaming high, sometimes burning low. But always there are hands to transmit it to the next in line, and never has the prophetic torch gone out completely. Always there has been at least a flickering ray to disclose the path to those who have sought its guiding light. The molding, energizing force of Old Testament prophecy was already evident in Jewish history long before the dawn of the Christian era. The messianic hope of the Jews and their national aspirations, which were based on prophecies, profoundly affected their fundamental attitude toward other nations. It permeated their entire thinking and action, and it often determined, in turn, the treatment that the Jews themselves were accorded by the Gentile world. An early example, although perhaps traditional, may serve to indicate the influence of biblical prophecies even in the pagan world. The story of how Alexander the Great was induced to scare Jerusalem after hearing himself described from the Jewish sacred scrolls as the first king, symbolized by the notable and victorious horn on the head of the Grecian goat, which was one of Daniel's symbolic beasts of prophecy. It is, of course, well known to all that Christ applied many Old Testament predictions to his own life and death, and that the popular Jewish misconception of those very prophecies was the cause of his rejection by his own nation. Nevertheless, the messianic hope continued to play a dominant part in the life and aspirations of the Jews during the latter centuries of the diaspora. And various pseudo-messianic movements springing up among them gave false courage and strength to many for a time, while others led to definite disaster and setbacks. Jesus, the star witness of all time. Jesus' statements concerning his own ministry, that he came just as the time was due to be fulfilled, that he was the long foretold anointed one who was to preach deliverance to the captives, and as many other references to the prophecies of the Old Testament reveal only too clearly the importance that Christ assigned to inspired prophecy. He was the star witness of all time in the field of prophecy. He ennobled and elevated sacred prophecy and prophetic interpretation, putting the seal of divine approval upon it. The development of the early Christian church was definitely based on the prophetic hope of the Savior's speedy return at the end of the age, with its tremendous events, the rolling back of the heavens as a scroll, the appearing of the Son of Man, the resurrection of the dead, and the fearful yet glorious judgment scenes, followed by the eternal heavenly kingdom to come. In ardent expectation of this glorious future, the early Christians were constrained to spread the gospel of salvation with zealous haste. And it was this concept that nerved them to withstand the terrible agonies of mutilation by wild beasts and an ignominious death in the amphitheater, the searing flames of the martyr's stake, and all other manifestations of the wrath of the pagan Roman dragon warring upon the church. Thus, it was with Justin Martyr of the 2nd century, in his famous apologies to the pagan Roman rulers. Their understanding of the times caused these Christian stalwarts to pray repeatedly for the continuance of the restraining Roman Empire, lest the dreaded worst times of Antichrist expected to follow upon its fall should overtake them in their day. Prophecy was a beacon light guiding the church of the centuries following, showing them where they were in the march of time, as they first awaited and then apprehensively watched the fateful breakup of the Roman Empire. When hope of a speedy return of the Savior grew dim, because several church centuries had rolled by, a revolutionary view of prophecy was introduced, which resulted in a new orientation and a new ideology. It started the church off in another direction. Did not prophecy speak of a glorious 1,000-year reign of the saints? Perhaps this period was not heavenly but earthly. Perhaps, after all, it was not future but present, beginning with the first instead of the second advent. Augustine, in his treatise, The City of God, which molded the concepts of the Christian West for 1,000 years thereafter, definitely placed the accent upon an earthly fulfillment of those age-old prophecies. On the assumption that the millennial reign had already begun on earth, and that the church was God's only true exponent and representative, the Roman church soon asserted power over body, soul, and spirit, as well as over peasant, king, and sage. It claimed to be the sole guardian of truth and the only custodian of salvation. It was the uplifting of the prophetic torch again after the year 1000 that illuminated the winding pathway through the Middle Ages. Under such men as the Venerable Bede, Bernard of Clairvaux, and Joachim of Flores, with the Roman Church, prophecy came again into the thinking of many. The fires of enthusiasm for the Crusades, kindled among the masses, were kept aflame through asserting that the Saracenic Antichrist had taken possession of God's holy city, and that God definitely directed the Christians to rout these diabolical hordes of Gog and Magog. But the church had grown vain and arrogant. Earnest, spiritual-minded souls were distressed and aggrieved. They were disgusted with what they saw of sin, pride, and gross corruption in high places among those who administered the holy sacraments, and now claimed to be on a level high above the simple layman. And when the common folk came into possession of the Bible, they found in its prophecies the portrayals of Babylon, the great courtesan, and of Antichrist, the oppressor of God's truth and people. Could it be that these were allusions to the church, fallen from its high calling and place? Whole movements sprang up, which found their invincible strength and consolation, despite peril and persecution, in the prophecies that spoke of the final glory of God's loyal little band, of their acceptance in the councils of heaven as they clad in white robes and with palms of victory in their hands. The irrepressible Waldenses were fortified for the stake and the sword by their study and application of prophecy. Prophecy inspired some of the trenchant poems of Dante in the soul, searching sonnets of Petrarch in the early Renaissance. Prophecy soon after guided Wycliffe in his contest with Rome. It was prophecy that fortified Huss and Savonarola for the flames of the martyr stake. It was prophecy that Columbus, faithful son of the Roman Church, cited as foretelling his voyages to the New World, as he rejoiced in the thought of helping to bring about the preaching of the gospel to all before the end of time. He considered his astonishing discoveries but a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, a subject that occupied his thoughts to such an extent that, famous discoverer though he was, he even wrote a treatise on the prophecies. And it was by the flaming torch of prophecy that Luther sought to identify his mortal foe and was encouraged to make his epical break with Rome. Prophecy definitely molded the aggressive course of the Reformation in Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, and even penetrated to France and Italy. The influence of the prophetic note on the Reformation is well nigh incalculable, though largely unrecognized and unheralded by historians and biographers. When Luther saw the hopelessness of reforming the church from within, he began to think of her as apostate from God, a body from which he must separate. When he burned the Pope's bull as the bull of the prophesied Antichrist, he sounded the battle cry to withdraw from her communion and to fight against the anti-Christian system. This clarion call soon echoed throughout all Europe with tremendous effect. Its repercussions were felt everywhere. So it was not merely the medieval mind which stretched prophecy. The highly educated Reformation leaders used prophecy as one of their mightiest weapons in calling upon the faithful to separate from Babylon, the fallen church, and to break with the Antichrist who had usurped the place of God and who sat enthroned in the temple of God. But they did not stop there. They wrote a veritable stream of tractates and commentaries and made the common people familiar with the interpretations of the four world powers of Daniel and the phrasings of the other prophetic symbols of the book. From the Reformation stems a long line of prophetic expositions which molded Protestant thinking for centuries after their day. These were based on what came to be known as the historical school of prophetic interpretation, the progressive and continuous fulfillment of prophecy in unbroken sequence from Daniel's day and the time of John on down to the second advent and the end of the age. It was these established principles of prophecy that nerved the English reformers for the cruel fires of Smithfield in the days of Bloody Mary. The key prophecy of Daniel 7 furnished the text for Knox's powerful first sermon, which moved all of Scotland. And it was actually the force of prophecy that King James I of England invoked in his astonishing appeal to the other potentates of Europe in 1609, based on the premise of the prophecies of the Antichrist in the Apocalypse. All the leading Protestant scholars wrote on the principal prophecies of the Bible as a matter of course, just as they wrote on the rest of the Bible. And among these commentators were often names not usually connected by us with prophetic exposition. Brilliant scientists and mathematicians, for example, like John Napier, Sir Isaac Newton, and William Whytt, and on. All walks of life were, in fact, represented. At the same time, the Old World witnesses were paralleled by vigorous writers in colonial America. Familiar names appear in a new role: John Cotton, the Mathers, Jonathan Edwards, and Timothy Dwight, to name but a few, as effective expositors of prophecy. Prophecy held a key place in the thinking of colonial leaders in all vocations: physicians, legislators, governors, judges, teachers, college presidents, historians, and poets, as well as the theologians. All were gripped by the force of fulfilled prophecy and gave utterance to remarkable expositions that have become unknown today to the vast majority. Prophetic terms were woven into the speech and literature of the times, as, for example, the famous New England Primer. Not only did Harvard College have a lecture series based on Bible prophecy, but also several of her earlier presidents wrote on prophecy. In the struggle for religious freedom in the American colonies, Roger Williams was, of course, the outstanding figure. He too considered religious intolerance a heritage from the persecuting beast of prophecy, and this he boldly published and pressed upon Parliament. But if prophecy was a forceful weapon in the hands of Protestants, it was also turned to effective account by the Catholics. Forced to the defensive by the uncomplimentary prophetic symbols and epithets applied by Protestant expositors to the papacy, the Jesuits produced two counter-interpretations of these self-same prophecies called futurism and preterism. These were designed to parry the force of Protestant Reformation teachings and to shift the application of the Antichrist and similar prophecies away from the Pope and out of the Middle Ages. And these systems left their indelible mark upon history. They've profoundly influenced multitudes, not simply within the Catholic Church, but strangely enough, outside, in the very ranks of Protestantism as well. In fact, they have split Protestantism as regards prophecy.